Ladies and gentlemen, here on Law and Crime, we have been previewing our next case, and we are so excited to bring it to you. It is the Jessica Chambers case, the retrial of Quentin Tellis, the man who is going to be on trial the second time for allegedly burning this young 19-year-old girl alive. She sustained burns to 98% of her body, and it was a horrific, horrific scene. I mean, I have to tell you, here on Law and Crime, one of the most dastardly, one of the most graphic cases that we've ever covered. And we are going to cover the retrial because Quentin Tellis' first trial ended in a mistrial. And what we know so far about this new trial, it's going to be different than what happened the first time around. One of the biggest issues is that Jessica Chambers allegedly made a dying declaration to first responders. When they asked her, "Who did this to you?" and she was in such a burned state, they said that what they heard was either an Eric or a Derek, which is a far cry from a Quentin or a Tellis. Well, we learned that a speech pathologist will be called to the stand to talk more about someone who is in that burned condition, what those words really mean. Now, our very own Kathy Russin is going to be there and reporting back to us live from the courtroom. You're not going to want to miss anything, but we have to talk about Jessica Chambers right now, and joining me is somebody who is an expert on this case, somebody who joined us the first time we covered it and is going to join us now. Forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, great to see you again.
Good to be with you, my friend.
So let's talk about that speech pathologist. The idea that this young girl sustained burns all over her body and it would have affected her vocal cords, in your opinion, does that affect what she was saying as an Eric or Derek? Was it possible, you think, that she was trying to say Quentin or Tellis and it came out as Eric or Derek, or really was she saying another individual?
I think what I'd like to do, Jesse, is rephrase what was just said. She was not just burned all over her body. She was literally burned internally. And let's think about this, and let's think about the dynamics, the fire dynamics that are going on. And just indulge me for a second. When she is engulfed in flame, she is inhalating superheated gas. This isn't just affecting her exterior. This is infecting her nostrils, the inside of her mouth, and down her throat. This leads to inflammation, and it can also compromise the airway as well as her ability to vocalize things. So this is going to be a key bit of evidence. I'm kind of interested in hearing what a speech pathologist would have to say relative to this, and I think that you have to kind of frame this in the context of not just what could she say, verbalized, but also what's going on up here. Mm-hmm. You know, she's been horribly traumatized at this moment in time.
I can't even imagine what that's like, and the defense is going to jump on that. Obviously, they have the victim saying somebody else did it, but you have to understand the factors, and you have to understand the circumstances of what she was going through. We are going to talk more about Jessica Chambers in a minute, but as I said at the top of the program, we have an update for you in the Stanley Liggins case out of Iowa. Now, what happened yesterday? Did the jury come back with a verdict of guilty or not guilty? Well, let's see what happened.
Have any members indicated any willingness to change his or her mind concerning their own position on this case? And during your deliberations, have you made any progress towards reaching a unanimous decision?
Nothing more.
Do you feel the jury is unable to reach a unanimous decision or a full agreement? Does any juror disagree with that? If you do, please raise your hand. All right, no hands are raised. Do counsel appear that it appears this jury is deadlocked and there'll be no fruitful deliberations forthcoming? All right.
All right, can we say that we're that surprised? We knew the jury was deadlocked on Friday, but what it was concluded, it ended in a mistrial. Now, Joseph, this was a 3-decade-old murder mystery. This guy was on trial 2 other times and now is going to be on trial this 3rd time. It's a question of not whether the prosecution, the state, will try him a 4th time, which is pretty incredible to think about. Are you surprised that this case, which is so old, ended this way?
No. No, I'm really not, Jesse. I was kind of scratching my head over it to begin with. There was such a myriad of kind of convoluted physical evidence that was here, and I think the tough thing for me, and probably a tough thing for the jurors, was to be able to contextualize all of this stuff after so many years. It's difficult for the prosecution and state to put a trial on with faded memories, with evidence that has been stowed away for all this period of time, and dragging everything back out and having a fresh sensibility about it. And plus, look, the world's aware that this is the third time, that this thing has come to trial. So yeah, it left me scratching my head a bit.
It's one of those cases where the evidence is kind of old, the defendant is older than he was. It's hard for a jury to sit there in any case, but let alone this one. So if they decide to retry him, we'll have to let you know, and we will update you about Stanley Liggins. But when we come back, we're talking about Jason Van Dyke. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everybody. We are talking about a lot here on the program. One of the busiest days I know I've ever covered here on Law and Crimes. But the first thing we want to talk about is going to be our live feed. All right, you have the defense's expert who's testifying to something very different from what the medical examiner testified for the state. Back here with Joseph Scott Morgan, who could help explain a lot of the questions I have right here. At the end of the day, Joseph, we have a guy who's dead. We know who shot him. We know how he was shot. Why does it matter whether or not it was one bullet out of the 16 that ultimately proved rapidly fatal, or whether each one ultimately led to his death? Explain this, the significance of this to me, and maybe we can understand what the jurors are thinking.
It doesn't take a PhD to understand this. The rationale behind all of this song and dance that you're seeing relative to the gunshot wounds and sequencing, which is very difficult, as we saw evidenced in the video. They're attempting to mitigate pain and suffering here. And I know that that's generally a term that's applied in civil litigation, but just follow me here. They're trying to state that his death was quick, that he didn't languish, and they're trying to, I would imagine in some way at least, put this notion of merciful into the brains of the jury. That's the only thing that I can really think of, because when you watch the video, this is such a dynamic event where this fellow is, jogging down the street. He's presenting with something in his hand. They're making a decision at that moment. And then all of a sudden you kind of see him spin about. You see the officers there with the weapons. What position were they in? And I don't know that you can necessarily sequence these injuries.
Obviously, the main discussion is this murder or is this a justified shooting? One of the things she testified to was his positionality, right? The fact that he was almost positioned towards Jason Van Dyke when that fatal shot was hit, which would seem to suggest, if I'm sitting on the jury and I see the dash cam footage, it's one thing, but if he's faced towards the officer with a knife, that provides a different narrative of self-defense than what the prosecution was saying. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And what they're trying to do is demonstrate him in the position of an aggressor. This has been a narrative that's been painted throughout this trial, where they're talking about that this young fellow was advancing on the police with a weapon, and they were in fear for their lives as well as public safety. And there's a park nearby and other people and all these sorts of things that they've talked about. And so this narrative that they're trying to demonstrate is that his shoulders were in fact turned toward the police officer, and that he was receiving the full brunt of the force, and that he was nailed in the chest. I think she said right side, nailed. And one of the other things that I kind of wanted to address here that's kind of left us kind of swinging in the breeze here, that this Dr. T had brought out, is the fact that there were no internal photos taken of these organs. And that's from a descriptor standpoint. I want to know, she was talking about penetrating versus perforating injuries. Penetrating means it just enters an organ. Perforating means that it passes through. Now, last week when the medical examiner testified, she talked about pulpification of organs. That means that these organs are just being destroyed. And I don't doubt that it was quick and sudden, but I think that it's it's very difficult to try to sequence these things and paint a narrative as to whether or not he did or did not suffer. He was shot a lot.
Yeah, the jury's going to have to sit there and determine who's credible here. Which expert do they rely on more, which is a difficult job in any case, but let alone this one where there's so much at stake. And you have the medical examiner and Dr. Ortiz saying two radically different things. When we come back, though, there's a lot more to talk about with this case, and we're going to talk with about some of the other key witnesses. So stay tuned here on Law&Crime. Let's try to break down this back and forth about when Laquan McDonald died. Back here with Joseph Scott Morgan. What is going on here? Why does it matter the exact moment that he died, whether or not he had a pulse when first responders came? I know there seems to be some discrepancy here, but in the overall arc of the case, when we're trying to see if this was a justified shooting or not, from your perspective as a forensic death investigator, what's happening here?
They're attempting to discuss or put into play the level of lethality of the gunshot wound or wounds that that this young man sustained. And what they're talking about is the paramedic had related that they had him hooked up to a monitor at that moment in time. And listen, somebody can be unconscious and still be alive. Now, whether or not there is an awareness of pain and suffering and all these other things they're trying to mitigate in this, because that's what this comes down to, is for somebody else to answer. But if there is life, if there is in fact life and the monitor is showing it, then, you know, his heart is still beating at that point in time.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. These little points are so important for the jury. Let's play a little bit of the medical examiner, who we've talked about so much this morning, because the medical examiner's testimony was very different than the defense's expert. Take a look. All right, so let's break down the medical examiner here, because her testimony is very different than what the defense's expert had to say. Back here with Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. So she's saying, again, that, okay, each shot, he felt each shot contributed to his death. At the same point, I think we were talking about it in the break, about maybe her saying at one point in her testimony you can't sequence the time of death. So can you explain this to us and help understand what's going on here?
Jesse, she's talking about, I remember distinctly when I was on previously that she had mentioned that it was highly unlikely that you could sequence these. And when we say sequence, what we're talking about is the order in which these insults or gunshot wounds were sustained. And so that she stated that it would be very difficult. And I have to agree with her to a certain point in this, because this is highly dynamic. It's fluid. It's not like it's in a static environment and someone is, you know, like in an execution where they're, you know, old-fashioned execution where they're tied to a pole, you know, and you can kind of see them being shot down range. This young gentleman is in a multi-dimensional environment. He's being, you know, he's reactive. He's reactive to pain. He's reactive to stimulus, all these sorts of things that occur. And then you've got these gunshot wounds that are going off. And the gunshots even continued. Remember, we saw that one image, even after he's down and it didn't even strike the body. Remember, we saw the dust fly up in that particular instance. So it's a very dynamic environment. And what she's saying is that you can't sequence these things. So this goes back to what the defense was saying, where this was there was a single lethal shot that essentially what she's saying is put him out of his misery in that moment in time, and that it came early, and that's what she's trying to get at here. I guess at the end of the day, though, I mean, some of this is new territory for a lot of people, especially if you're sitting on a jury and you have no idea about the criminal justice system or how forensics works. Do they, based upon your experience, do they harp on this? I mean, they say, listen, you have a 17-year-old boy who was shot, 16 shots were fired. I'm not really going to hold on to what shot ultimately killed him, how long he was alive for. That's not enough for me to determine whether or not this was justified or not. Yeah, you know, Jesse, you and I have actually talked before about this, and it's interesting and it's important to know that for forensic scientists and the courts, you can literally, and I like that this is a term that I've kind of coined, you can science a case to death. At the end of the day, how effective are your expert witnesses in talking to the everyday person? You know, can you take complex constructs, scientific constructs, and break them down to the everyday guy, gal that's going to be sitting on that jury and having to make these monumental decisions about the outcome of somebody's life?
Yeah, and it's a tough case because you're looking at this and the dash cam footage becomes super important, but these forensic experts are really critical to understand what happened to Laquan McDonald. It just becomes a question of what will the jury ultimately hold on to. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Okay, that's the defense trying to justify the shooting of their client, Jason Van Dyke, putting the impetus on the victim. Will it work? We'll have to see. But here on Law and Crime, we are carefully monitoring the Jessica Chambers case. This is going to be one of the biggest cases we've ever covered, and we've already covered the first time Quentin Tallis was tried for the murder of this young girl, because now, since that first case ended in a mistrial, he's going to be tried again. And I want to talk to Joseph Scott Morgan about this as we wait for the live feed. Joseph, one of the most disturbing aspects of this case is this girl was burned alive. She was doused with gasoline and set on fire, but she survived for a period of time. I don't know if the last thing that I heard was 30 minutes she might have been alive. How is that possible?
I have no idea. I sit here and I scratch my head and think about it, and you talk about pain and suffering. You know, and this is the thing. The only thing I can really contribute it to is the fact that she was so young and vital. You know, if it happened to maybe someone that was infirmed or a bit older, maybe they would not have made it as long as she did. But she was able to survive a helicopter ride to Memphis to get her up there to be treated. One other point here I'd like to make, Jesse, is this idea of the vocalization of whatever it was that she said. We addressed this earlier relative to the upcoming testimony. It's quite interesting that this mountain of evidence that we have, everything from DNA to accelerants to everything else, seems as though it's kind of being pushed into the background because of this statement that she may have made. And that's kind of curious to me, I think, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in this next trial. Well,
I agree with you. There's so many important pieces of evidence, including the fact we learned that they are going to create a reconstruction of the crime scene, which will be definitely something to watch. But before we go, we have a special message from our very own Aaron Keller about Jessica Chambers. Take a look. So this witness for the defense is helping tell the story of how Laquan McDonald was engaged in an altercation with the police on a separate incident. But does that matter? Back here with Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, you've seen a lot of cases. Your testimony is crucial to a lot of these cases, and we've seen a lot of this testimony before. But when we're looking at the actual crime scene, whether or not this was a justified shooting or not, does this really matter?
I don't think that it does at the end of the day. For me, I'm a science guy. I want to see, you know, I'm not interested necessarily in what the motivation was or the why. I hate the question why. I want to know what happened at the end of the day and the dynamics at the scene, because at the end of the day, that's what we're attempting to vet here, to interpret, you know, what happened at that moment in time when this fellow was killed, and was it justifiable? And you know, so yeah, I mean, this is all fine and good. I understand what the defense is attempting to do here, but in the middle of that street that night, what actually happened, and did it fit within the standards set by the law?
That's a great explanation, and that is what we're trying to find out. Throughout all the clutter, we have to try to stay clear and see what the real big issue is. I want to play the testimony, though, of Officer Tyler Sage from the Westmont Police Department, again, a witness for the defense, talking about the criminality of the victim. Take a look. The defense is keen on trying to point that Laquan McDonald really was the guilty party that night, that he was a danger to others, that he was a threat, and that he has had run-ins with the law. You know, I'm here again with Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, one of the interesting things that the defense wants to exploit is that this young man allegedly had PCP in his system at the time of the shooting. If that's true, what does that do to the body? What does that do to someone's mental state? So if he's on PCP, carrying this knife and walking next to police, can you try to explain what that means for him?
Yeah. The PCP itself, phencyclidine, actually acts as it's a hallucinogen as it works on humans. I don't know if many people know the history behind it, but PCP was initially an equine tranquilizer. It would be applied to horses, and over this period of time, people began to adapt it, to use it for nefarious purposes, to get high, and it highly effective hallucinogen, and it disorients the individual to reality. Also, it kind of imbues them with a perceived invincibility many times. There are all kinds of tales out there of people who seem to have superhuman strength, tiny people who can, fight off, a multitude of police officers that are attempting to restrain them. So yeah, that changes the narrative a little bit if it turns out that he has the PCP in his system, and that will be painted to demonstrate how dangerous it is. I would not be surprised to see them talk about other instances where people have had PCP in their system and what this caused these individuals to do. Just, providing some histrionics. We talked about the jury, them trying to understand the effects of this particular drug.
Well, let's learn a little bit more about the drug and who Laquan McDonald was from Miguel de Jesus, who's from the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, where Laquan was at one point. Let's find out. Okay, so that was Miguel de Jesus, a person that knew Laquan McDonald, talking about his aggression. But Joseph, when we were last talking about the PCP in his system, clearly what the defense is demonstrating is that Laquan McDonald had a violent history and an aggressive history. Does PCP, for lack of better terms, does it aggravate the aggression of an individual? Does it create a violent tendency in somebody? I mean, we knew he was carrying a knife and he was walking next to police, but again, does it amplify that?
Yes, actually it does. There's evidence of that in the literature, and also previous instances we've got a long history in this country dating back to the 70s in regards to PCP. It's something that's well known, and the high or the altered state that it kind of puts these individuals in is so much more intense, say for instance, than individuals that might be experimenting with things like mushrooms or acid, that sort of thing. This is very intense. And it has been hinted at over the years that if somebody is naturally aggressive, if they have this kind of a proclivity in their personality, you introduce PCP, and it's a lethal mix.
I don't disagree with that at all. I think the facts of the case, the whole scenario would be different if Laquan McDonald was walking towards the police. It would help the defense's narrative to say that he was aggressive and he was going to take certain action. And if the defendant knew about Laquan McDonald's history and knew that he had these interactions, but he didn't know him, he didn't know any facts about him, and he didn't even know that he was on PCP. We'll take a quick break. A lot more to discuss when we get back. Stay tuned. Okay, so that's a view of the crime scene and understanding how some of the evidence was collected. Joseph, I guess the overarching question is, what does the jury gain from these photos and this testimony?
It gives them orientation to kind of the space in which this took place. All of our viewers, you're familiar seeing markers like that. If I can just kind of explain that very briefly. When you see that overall shot, that still shot that they showed out of court, you saw kind of a sea of these little yellow markers. What that gives us an indication is that underneath each one of those, or immediately adjacent to it, is a piece of evidence that you could not otherwise appreciate without the marker there, because these things can be very, very tiny. It also serves as an area to protect it, so that when people are trying to move their way through the scene to work the scene, they're not kicking evidence. Now, what it does not do, however, and people need to really understand this, what it does not do is, going back to sequencing, it should not be implied that any of these markers give us an idea as to what sequence these pieces of evidence were deposited, whether they be the actual rounds that may have passed through the body, spent casings, or anything else that was kicked up as a result of this.
It's interesting. I mean, we look at it, we try to understand it, and, you know, we read articles all about the case, we have a bigger understanding, but sit in that jury box and all you know is what's told in that courtroom, and you can't just rely on the opening statements. They got to build their case with photos and evidence. Let's play a little bit more of the testimony of Officer Kamal Judah, this evidence technician, where it's a discussion about the clothing worn by Laquan McDonald, the blood stains. It can get pretty graphic, but let's play it. Wow, collection of the bullet fragments, the blood-stained clothing. This is all for the prosecution to build their case. Joseph, I can't help but think today we're covering a lot of different cases. In fact, we have a shooting now. We're going to be covering the Jessica Chambers case with a girl who was burned alive. We're going to cover this other case out of Florida about a young girl who allegedly stabbed her ex-boyfriend. How does analyzing a shooting differ from all these other kinds of crime scenes and murder cases?
Well, relative to gunfire, particularly one that where we're talking about in the Van Dyke case, we have evidence that is spread far and wide, very dynamic. We've talked about the dynamicism of the scene. You have things that are spread about, and also keep in mind, Jesse, and this was a great point. I'm glad you guys showed that clip of you know, his remains actually went from the scene to the hospital, and they had to go to the hospital and collect that. You know, those items there.
Joseph, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We just got an update. It's funny, I just mentioned Jessica Chambers. It's live right now, so we are going to go live into that courtroom. You don't want to miss anything. The retrial of Quentin Tellis. Let's go live right now.
The fire.
You're listening to the extremely emotional testimony of Lisa Chambers. This was this young girl's mother talking about what happened the night that she died. I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, you know, we saw the picture of Jessica, young, vibrant, and you can't help but think what she looked like after this attack. Yeah,
I've seen the images, and they're striking, just absolutely striking. Her body devastated by just this all-engulfing flame that was introduced into that moment in time. Yep.
It's horrific to think about, and you're also thinking that the jury is going to see all evidence of what happened and how difficult it must be to be in that courtroom, and also difficult for the family to have to relive all of this, because this is the second time that Quentin Tellis is on trial. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime.